This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
The attacks on us have been intensified the last couple of years, but they've been going on for the whole 35, 40 years of the reactionary conservative ideological assault in the states and the neoliberal assault around the world. So we're experiencing what many other workers are experiencing around the world. It's been particularly acute in the American public services. America has a very energetic right wing that's playing to the tax aversion of a lot of voters, and they were very successful in the November 2010 elections. And so they chose to take the mandate that they had achieved politically in those elections to engage in a frontal assault, not just on public services, but on the very rights to bargain collectively that we have long enjoyed in most of the United States. So we were attacked directly and rapidly. And the first lesson that I'm here to share with my colleagues in the North is to be prepared to respond rapidly and to respond broadly and deeply. We would not have survived those onslaughts had we not had an incredible upsurge of member mobilization, participation, and militancy that we have enjoyed, and that has been the major way we have survived over the last 2 years.
You've survived. Tell me about that, because the story we get in the mainstream media is that labor in the United States public service where unions are being annihilated. But you say you've survived. Tell me about that survival.
We've done much better than survived. We have suffered significant defeats. And I don't mean to minimize any of the defeats. In Wisconsin, where we not only lost our collective bargaining rights and the whole framework and collective bargaining system, and we've lost many of our members have fallen away, where they took substantial cuts in their take-home pay, over 10% for the average public employee in Wisconsin. In Michigan and Indiana, where a new right-to-work law has been enacted, and many other places, there have been significant defeats. But next to those defeats have been battles on the same subjects where we've turned back the opposition, even where Republicans proclaimed that they had the votes. It turned out that because in reaction to public pressure and pressure from our members, but also from our members' neighbors and our members' relatives and our members' friends and the citizens at large, they held off from implementing plans that they had. And then we recently had a national election in the states that went much more favorably for organized labor, the re-election of Barack Obama. It's not a cure to all of the ills that we face. It's not even a first line of defense, but it's a setback for the right wing. And they know that, and they're a little bit back on their heels. And we now have to take advantage of this moment, breathing room, to try to start rolling back some of the defeats that we've suffered, and to try to establish a new round of gains for American workers.
You mentioned some victories that we probably are not aware of. Not many Canadians would be aware of these victories. So tell us about one or two of them, if you can, just especially if they're good examples of things to learn from.
So let's start with Florida, a very tough jurisdiction for us to work in. 2 years ago, the new governor, his name is Rick Scott, a guy who made hundreds of millions of dollars as a financier in the private hospital industry, and was convicted of the largest fraud of the American Medicare system. Nevertheless, he still walked away with a couple $100 million, and he invested it in getting himself elected governor of Florida. They plan to privatize half of the state prisons in one fell swoop. All the prisons south of the middle of the state were going to be turned over to one private prison operating company, and they had in the Florida State Senate a 10-vote majority for their party, for the Republican Party, and the labor movement found 11 Republican state senators who resisted every pressure that was put onto them and voted to defend the unions. They were called in individually by Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush is the older brother of the great George Bush that you recall. They were worked over by the governor. He went to their offices. He threatened them. He gave them every kind of blandishment, and they stood with us. They stood with us because their neighbors and the public service workers that they knew, the firefighters and the cops and the social service workers and librarians, had talked to them and had made it clear that this was a terrible thing, and that they stood with the prison workers. And then we were all in a fight to defend our pensions against his legislation. That didn't go so well. We've had a setback on the Florida retirement system, a very well-funded system, but still one that they wanted to take steps to diminishing. So we have these fights all over the country that are going on right now today. As we're standing here, the House of Representatives in the state of Missouri is having a hearing on right to work. We think we have the means to defeat it in Missouri, but they're going to try very hard to enact that. They're inspired by what happened in Michigan last fall.
You mentioned an upsurge from the rank and file in resistance to the privatization austerity agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that upsurge, because we're not hearing that either in the news.
Well, think back 2 years. Think back 2 years to Wisconsin. Think back to February 11th, 2011, which is 2 years ago this coming Monday, when the governor introduced the bill to terminate public employee collective bargaining. His plan was to have it enacted into law within 5 days. And the graduate teaching assistants from the University of Wisconsin marched up State Street and walked into the state capitol and took over the building. And the next day, the high school students from the 4 Madison area high schools walked out of class, marched downtown, and joined them. And they stayed overnight. And then the workers from our membership, the public school teachers, construction workers, manufacturing workers, workers from every walk of life, every part of the labor movement, joined them and stayed in that state capitol, occupied the building. The police department unions were there with us. The firefighters were there with us. And for 28 days, we prevented the legislature, the majority prepared to vote us out of business, from taking the action that they ultimately did. They ultimately did it in a way that was actually illegal. But we have political courts in the state, so they got upheld by a 4-3 vote of the state Supreme Court, even though they did it without proper notice, open meetings, etc. But that inspired American workers to fight back, and continues to inspire them. And even though we have suffered additional setbacks, we tried to remove that governor from office, and we've came up short. But actually 47% of the voters in Wisconsin voted for regime change. It was very bold what we tried to do, and it was a bridge too far, but we are still in the fight. And that happened because tens of thousands of our members who had been perhaps passive about their union, loyal but passive about their union, realized that the only way that their standard of living and their organization, the things that they enjoyed and took for granted, was going to be preserved was if they took matters into their own hands. We have to do this ourselves, they realized. And so they did it. They were there. They went out in the cold of the winter, not quite as cold as you get up here, but it was pretty cold, and circulated petitions and stood on street corners and talked to their neighbors and went to their churches and talked to their friends and relatives and persuaded many of their fellow citizens that what was being done was wrong and was going to be harmful to everybody, not just to the public employee unions. And we will ultimately win that fight in Wisconsin. We will be in that battle for one day longer than the right-wingers are going to be in it, because that's going to be the day in which we prevail.
So again, to summarize, what's the lesson for Canadian workers facing this onslaught?
Well, number one, be prepared for a serious escalation of the challenge to the things that you enjoy. The things that maybe you take for granted, don't take them for granted anymore. Be prepared to fight to defend them. Number two, that it's up to you. It's up to you as individuals and collectively to mobilize. Mobilizing means not just marching. It means talking about the subjects to your neighbors, to who are not in unions perhaps, to your friends, even your relatives who don't necessarily understand how important it is for the common good of Canada the common good of all of our countries for there to be a strong and powerful labor movement. And be prepared to explain that and get a voice, your own voice. It's your own voice that can move mountains. And then reach out. Have your organizations, your trade unions, reach out to every possible colleague and ally, not just those in the same political party, but in every political party, every persuasion. The good of our society is at stake. Of all of our societies is at stake. The standards of living that we've attained is at risk, and the first line of defense is a strong labor movement.